speakers, Brian Reed and Home Bamanyard, who will be joining me today in this session. Brian Reed is currently an advisor for Lionfish Tech Advisors and works extensively with cybersecurity startups on emerging technologies. He joined Proofpoint in October 2020 as the Senior Director of Cybersecurity Strategy. Before Proofpoint, Brian was the Senior Director Analyst at Gartner. From 2015 to 2020, he published over 50 research notes at Gartner, covering a wide range of security and risk management topics. Brian has also presented at numerous Gartner conferences and information security events around the world. Before Gartner, he spent many years in a variety of business development, product management, and system emergency roles at companies including SourceFire, acquired by Cisco Systems, HP, McAfee, Internet Security Systems that was acquired by IBM. Brian also serves as an advisory board member for corporations and nonprofit organizations, and holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from the University of Georgia and a master's in business administration from the Kennesaw State University. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the floor. In our second panelist, Home Bamanyar from the house, it's a well-rounded and technology leader with over 20 years of experience working with large enterprise customers, as well as global engineer, marketing, and sales teams, driving innovative technologies. He's a cybersecurity veteran with over 10 years at Red Seal, where he drove the integration and modeling for cloud and traditional network devices, and over 10 years at Cisco, where he led engineering teams for Cisco Security Manager and IP Solutions Center product lines. He has a passion for strong customer relationships and turning customers into loyal advocates. Furthermore, he's the Chief Enablement Officer at Bridge Security. Now, before jumping into the conversation with these two big friends, I would like to ask the audience one question. How familiar are you with continuous threat and exposure? So I'm going to launch one first question. So you should be seeing it by now. How familiar are you with continuous threat and exposure management? I'm going to leave this question open for 45 seconds to allow you time to respond. The question is in the air. I'm getting responses already. Fantastic. We're eagerly waiting for all your responses. Keep in mind, each click, each choice you make contributes to our collective understanding of how businesses are navigating the cyber landscape. So we together will uncover the insights that empower us to face these challenges head on. We're 39 seconds on and 45 seconds. I'm ending the poll and sharing the results. So I'm inviting now, thank you very much for the responses. And dear panelists, I invite you to share your thoughts on these results. Are there any surprises or trends that caught your attention?
Yeah, Ham, I'll start. For me, it's interesting that a third of the respondents are very familiar with this term. This is a relatively new term that, like I said, Gartner has come out with. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, where the term CTEM came from, but it's interesting. I think there's a good mix of familiarity with what continuous threat exposure management is. So this should be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I agree. It's really good to see that there is both familiarity and also basic understanding with the term CTEM. So we will dive in and cover more details.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So with no further ado, let's turn the spotlight on our esteemed panelists for their invaluable insights. I'm gonna stop sharing the results. Oh, sorry. My apologies for that. So, Brian, the first question is for you. Could you please share with us what CTEM means and what's your opinion regarding whether we should think about it as a market or as a program?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, right? Because like you said in the intro, I spent a half decade plus at Gartner, was involved in a lot of these different markets and emerging technologies and the ways that end users thought about security technology. So it's really interesting. I think before we get into whether CTEM's a market or a program, probably makes sense to talk about where this acronym comes from, Continuous Threat Exposure Management. I'm going to paste a link here in the chat. For those of you that do have a Gartner license, Gartner published a really good research note on this back in July of last year, July of 2022, called Implement a Continuous Threat Exposure Management Program. So they're starting out and really defining it as a program, but it's a program that touches a number of different markets. And Ham and I are going to get into some things that you might be very familiar with, like vulnerability management and risk-based vulnerability management and pen testing, and a number of different parts that touch a lot of different areas of security operations. But really what CTEM is, to define it very simply, is it's an integrated, iterative approach to prioritize potential treatments. And there's this notion of continuous refinement, continuous improvements to your security posture. So it's not just a one scan at one point in history and then look back at the history and look at a single point in time. It's really tracking and looking at those continuous changes and what are the continuous improvements I can make. What this really means, and I'll quote Gartner here a couple of times, what this really means is creating a consistent and actionable security posture remediation and improvement plan. So you're not just going through and coming up with a list of vulnerabilities, you're actually building a plan that business executives can understand. This isn't just give me a list of everything that's got a CVSS score of 7.0 or higher. This is give me a plan for why I need to address this, and things that both businesses and architecture teams can add on. Again, I mentioned this is a lot more than just a vulnerability management program or risk-based vulnerability management, because you're constantly iterating, you're constantly understanding what I would call the real-time conditions on the ground, what's actually happening in the organization. What this means, since you're actually looking at the real conditions of what's happening on the ground, is you really need to have organizational buy-in that you're doing this. You can't just sort of sit back in your security operations tower and go scan things and not let anybody know what you're doing, and doing assessments and looking deeply at systems and posture. You've got to really, it's a team sport here. You've got to let the organization know what you're doing. Otherwise, you run into this problem that I would call accountability without authority. So if you don't have that buy-in to say, hey, we're really looking continuously at what's happening, and we need to make very quick decisions on changing our security posture. If you're just scanning, and not having that right to actually go in and make remediations, make those treatments, then you're really not doing CTEM. You're doing very reactive vulnerability management. So it's important to understand that. So like I said, CTEM at this stage is really a program and not necessarily a market. I talk about CTEM as a program and a mindset. And as such, you really need that investment and buy-in from going outside of IT and InfoSec to the business really understanding why you need to look continuously. What does our risk posture look like? Do we justify this? So again, it goes back to that continuous notion. You're going to hear that word continuous a lot from Ham, I think, and myself. And the other thing I think that's really interesting about CTEM, before I turn it over to Ham here, is that there's this notion of cyclical. You're not always, because this is continuous, you're going to have ebbs and flows. You're going to have highs and lows, and you need to be able to react accordingly. It's not just sort of a steady state. a great example of some of those highs and lows. We've all been through mergers or acquisitions or divestitures or some other change of control from an organization standpoint. That might create an influx of new employees. It might create a need for, let's say, your company is buying another company. You might have a small team working on that acquisition, and that might create a heightened sense of needing different security treatments. You might be standing up a clean room or an executive boardroom, digital boardroom kind of thing for secure documents. That might involve a different set of security treatments that you need around that. So you need a process and a program that adjusts and adapts to those real-time conditions on the ground. So again, CTEM is not just a static, it's not the new name for vulnerability management. It's really understanding and marrying up the conditions of what's happening in the organization with what you need to do from a security posture management standpoint.
Amazing. Thank you, Brian. And having all that in mind, from your perspective, how does the security validation technologies and platform play in the CTEM?
Yeah, that's a great question. Many organizations have already made a fair amount of investment in various security validation technologies. As Brian just pointed out, CTEM is not a tool. It's a mindset. It's a program. So many of the security validation tools that you've already invested in can also be utilized under the CTEM umbrella. There are a number of security validation technologies that are of special importance in CTEM. For example, automated pen testing tools, breach and attack simulation tools, BAS tools, they play a special role in CTEM because they validate how attackers can actually exploit a given exposure and how the existing security controls that you may have put in place will react when such exploits happen. Also, there is an emerging technology, external attack surface management, that plays a key role in CTEM as well. It's because it takes an attacker's perspective in identifying the critical assets that are reachable from the internet. So when this information is coupled with the vulnerabilities that are present on such assets, then that would help with the prioritization of exposures. So that means the prioritization would be done based on both the discoverability and exploitability. That combination is really critical. So Gabby, if you could share that slide that shows Gartner's hype cycle for security operations, that would be great. This report was just published by Gartner last month, and it highlights a number of these technologies that I just mentioned. So for example, external attack surface management and automated pen testing and red teaming tools are both emerging technologies with a huge potential as reflected in Gartner's report.
I am trying to share it and my computer, it's just giving me a bit of hard time at the second, so give me just 1 second, please.
Yeah, no worries.
Oh. It would be fun, and it wouldn't be live without some Zoom problems.
Sure, there it is. You should be seeing it right now.
Yeah, we've got it.
There we go. Yeah, as you see, there are a couple of emerging technologies, automated pen testing and red teaming, and also external attack management, attack surface management. And you see that BAS has made it to the right of the curve and is moving forward. So these are important technologies that can play a key role in a successful CTEM program.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So having that input, I will turn the attention back to the audience and ask again another question, because the previous one worked out very, very well. So I'm gonna make another poll to the audience and ask, this time I launch another question. So do you actually use a security validation platform? I'm going to use the same rules. Just keep it up for 45 seconds to record your responses. And of course, we really appreciate your active engagement for a dynamic layer on our discussions. And we're already having a lot of responses. That is fantastic. Makes so much fun on our panel. We have many responses already. Just a few seconds to go.
Yeah, and if you can't see that poll, if you've got multiple monitors, it might be hiding behind a window or two. Thanks, Zoom.
Okay, that's it. And I'm sharing the results right now. So again, Brian and Home, I'm gonna please ask you to comment on those results. How do those findings resonate with your experience?
Yeah, Home,
Sure,
I would
Brian,
say,
I'll go.
oh, go ahead, jump in. Go ahead.
Sure. So I see that 45% say they're occasionally using security validation tools, and a good number of folks are saying that not yet, but are interested in using one. And we have a smaller percentage of folks who are saying they're using security validation tools regularly. So that's an interesting mix, and it definitely reflects what's going on out there. So Brian, with your wide range of experience with larger enterprises, do you see a trend here that it's usually larger enterprises, larger organizations that are actively using a lot of security validation platforms, and smaller ones are just moving in that direction?
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? So I certainly Fortune 100, Global 1000s, you're probably going to have a majority of those answer yes regularly. With this poll, I really expected most respondents to answer in the middle there, either yes occasionally or not yet, but interested in using one. And that's really where 72%, if you combine those two, and that almost fits the 80-20 rule of statistics. So I really, it seems like it's pretty close to the mark, even with the a little bit of a smaller sample size. It makes a lot of sense. And I think that's where a lot of, certainly mid-sized enterprises are at, is, hey, we're really starting to look at this. We see the value in a security validation platform, and we're really starting to understand the things that we can get out of it.
Fantastic. Now I'm gonna turn back to the questions. Brian, could you please walk us through the key elements of the CTEM program?
Yeah, so when I was talking at the beginning about what is a continuous threat exposure management program, this is really the 5 steps that Gartner lays out for us here. And what's interesting, and you're going to see this across a lot of different providers out there, there are going to be certain providers that are very specialized in some of these areas and can go very, very deep in some of these areas. And Home's going to talk about a couple of those for Ridge in a minute. But just to walk through all 5 of these, if you start at the top and look at scoping, again, I mentioned this is really more than vulnerability assessment or an external pen test of your own assets. This really gets into a lot of different areas, like third-party risk, different supply chain dependencies you might have, different shared code repositories that might live inside your organization or some other third party. And it's also measuring things like your likely exposure to things like open source or proprietary software libraries that you might be using. A lot of times, Home just mentioned starting with external attack surface management. And this, a lot of times, EASM, or external attack surface management, or looking at your SaaS security posture management, is usually a good starting place. And then looking into other areas like digital risk, social media monitoring, dark web monitoring, to help define and round out that scope. Once you get the scoping sorted out, then you're in that discovery phase. So again, this goes beyond classic asset management of understanding what are all my digital assets, what are all my software assets, what are my people and how do they relate to those assets. This also looks at things like misconfigurations and other problematic areas, like potentially identity gaps, things like machine assets, shadow asset or shadow admin accounts, as well as your exposure to attacks, to vulnerabilities, and the different privileges that might be in there. So discovery is really pulling the things together within the scope and getting a greater understanding. Once you pull that together, you're then into the prioritization phase. And this is really the heart of CTEM. This is where CTEM is not trying to instantly remediate or fix everything, but the goal is really to make sure that you've got that identification, that discovery really founded, and you're addressing the most likely threats that will actually face your organization, and you're formulating a proper response, not just a security response, not just an IT response, but an organization response and an overall plan. So prioritization will be some combination of urgency, severity, availability, of compensating controls and remediations. Your risk appetite factors into this, and the level of overall risk to your organization. So prioritization is really where it all comes together and the decision process starts to get made. Validation then basically backs up the decision. This is a stage where you need to confirm where an identified exposure warrants that prioritization. So you're basically, validation is the proving ground. This is where you're proving that the prioritization, you said, hey, this is critical. We need to address this before anything else. Well, validation is going to give you that ammunition. It's going to give you that business case and justification for why you're doing that. So validation has technical components, certainly. So this is where things like pen testing results, red teaming results, breach and attack simulation, attack path analysis, as well as some different incident response components like tabletop exercises and advanced scenario planning come into this. There's really a big element of organizational acceptance here that needs to happen for successful validation. It's not just enough to go, this is a huge technical issue. If the business doesn't care about it and it's not a huge cost liability, this is probably not something that's going to pass the validation phase. So we need to have the right documentation, the right agreed upon policies, guidelines, and all of that in mind to really mitigate. And then the final stage is really mobilization. This is where it all comes together. And another thing to keep in mind is all remediations can't be fully automated. This is where you can automate some of this. And this is really the magic of CTEM, is taking care of a lot of those steps 2, 3, and 4. So discovery, prioritization, validation. If you can automate those, have all of your business and technical inputs in one place, you can start getting very fast with the mobilization. And that's why that middle part of CTEM, if you get really good at that, using a combination of your own processes and tools and technologies, you can really speed through this process and it doesn't have to be cumbersome. But automated remediations a lot of times will get combined with your patch deployments. They might come in the form of a threat detection rule, like a SNORT IDS IPS rule, an emerging threats rule, something like that you maybe deploy to your network intrusion detection or prevention, or your cloud or your web or your email gateways, or some other security config change. You really can't use the automation here. The mobilization, everybody wants to jump this, everybody wants to snap their fingers and automate everything, but you can't automate without the knowledge and the know-how and doing the hard work in the discovery, the prioritization, and the validation phase. So, what ends up happening is IT and InfoSec will usually only offer up 1 or 2 possible solutions for a threat exposure scenario. But in reality, what we see with people that have started using CTEM is there's usually more than one or 2 answers. There's usually more than a yes or a no, or a 1 or a 0, or a black or a white. There are varying shades of different remediations that can take place. And that's another one of the magic points of CTEM. Remember, the outcome may not be to fully remediate a threat, but it might be to help you better understand the risks around that threat.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. And Home, now that we have learned about these 5 areas, could you please comment regarding what components of a CTEM program is Reach Security best able to address?
Absolutely. Our Reach Security's platform can best address the 3 middle steps of CTEM. Let me go over each one in more detail. I'll start with the prioritization step. With CTEM, as you just heard from Brian, the goal is not to remediate everything, but rather to identify and respond to the most likely threats that that you're facing at that particular point in time. So prioritization of threats is really critical. There are a number of factors that drive this prioritization. Some examples are, whether you have security controls put in place to respond to the threat, the urgency of the exposure, and also the risk that is posed to the organization as a result of the exposure. This last point, that is the identifying the business risks, is precisely what the approach is that is taken by Rich Security's automated pen testing platform, RidgeBot. The way it works is that out of the large number of vulnerabilities that are discovered on a given asset, RidgeBot focuses on identifying the ones that pose a risk. That is vulnerabilities that are exploitable, and also they are exposed to the attackers. So both of these are important. So what does that precisely mean? I want to answer this from the perspective of one of the customers currently utilizing Rich Security solution. So this is what they say. They say RidgeBot first discovers the attack surface on a given asset and then tries to identify the vulnerabilities that are present there. So if there is a vulnerability that is not part of an attack surface, it's automatically deprioritized. In addition, RidgeBot also attempts to exploit such vulnerabilities and provides evidence for each exploited vulnerability. The net result is that RidgeBot provides us a table of all discovered vulnerabilities, but moves the ones posing a risk at the very top. This captures it quite well. So RidgeBot does what vulnerability scanners do, provides a list of all potential vulnerabilities, but highlights the ones that are exploitable and discoverable right now, highlights them, moves them to the very top. So again, the keywords here are exploitability and discoverability. So that was for the prioritization step. The next CTEM step, where we have an effective solution, Rich Security has an effective solution, is the validation step. This is their step where the exposures that were prioritized in the previous step have to be assessed from both a technical perspective as well as that organizational acceptance that Brian was referring to. So the technical aspects of validation, exposure validation, they typically fall into two main categories. Pen testing and red teaming is the first category, and breach and attack simulation, BAS, is the second category. Rich Security's platform provides an AI-powered robot that performs automated pen testing. This AI-powered engine, what it does is it tries to think like a hacker and to mimic what a hacker does. The end result is that Rich Security provides a detailed technical report that pinpoints a number of key data points, such as the list of all the exploited vulnerabilities. These are your business risks, the evidence for each exploited vulnerability, providing proof for each one, and the kill chain analysis for each exploit. This is really important, an important data point to have. It will be utilized later. I'll talk about that later. And the possibility of pivot and lateral movement. That is, if an exploit leads to privilege escalation, can a hacker use that particular exploit, that the asset on which that exploit happened, as a pivot point and move laterally in the organization? And last but not least, the report also contains a health score capturing the security posture of the pen-tested assets. In addition to that, Rich Security's platform also provides BAS functionality, breach and attack simulation functionality. It performs a series of attacks that are defined by the MITRE attack framework in order to see if the existing security controls, such as your XDR, EDR, data loss prevention, DLP solutions, what have you, whether these are able to block these attacks. The end result in RidgeBot is another detailed report that contains the list of all the performed attacks and whether they were blocked or not. So, and there is also a block rate, which is a percentage of the attacks that were successfully blocked by the existing security controls that you have in place. So I want to mention one point here, that a low block rate, as reported by Ridgebot, may simply be the result of the misconfiguration of your security controls. For example, your XDR, EDR, DLP, etc. So, so far I've just touched upon the technical perspective, but there's also an organizational acceptance angle as well. So each organization needs to determine the minimum level of accuracy that is required in order to convince all the business stakeholders to do a treatment of a given exposure. For example, not all identified exposures may be ready to be patched at a particular point in time. Often the reason that we hear from our customers is that it would just cause some business interruption at that particular point in time. So the type of treatment for a given exposure, whether it be a patch or configuration changes, etc., it's really important for it to be agreed upon by all stakeholders. So it's not just a number of security engineers making decisions and trying to implement that. That really doesn't work. So CTEM, underscores the importance of that organizational buy-in, the organizational acceptance, all the key stakeholders, because it has to be a cyclical process. You have to keep repeating this. So it's really important, really critical for the tools that are used for validation to provide all the necessary data points so that the security staff and the stakeholders can make the right decision for their specific environment. Now, I mentioned about the kill chain analysis data that is provided for each of the exploits by Rich Security Solution. That's an example of a data point that can be used to immediately block the exposure by leveraging, for example, a firewall or an IDS IPS solution, and then at a later time to actually properly patch that vulnerability. So we've talked about CTEM steps 3 and 4, prioritization and validation. I want to go back and talk about step number 2, which is discovery. So exposure discovery involves the process of discovering the assets and also their risk profiles. So Rich Security Platform, Ridgebot, offers an external attack surface management, EASM tool or module that discovers all internet visible assets, whether they be on-prem or in the cloud, and also their corresponding attack surfaces. The assets that are discovered may be either IP hosts, for example, your Windows servers, Linux servers, etc., or maybe websites. So both are supported. The attack surfaces that are discovered on a given asset fall into 3 categories. The first one is a list of all the open ports and the corresponding data that Ridgebot discovers via smart fingerprinting. And then the second is the list of all the websites and the corresponding data for each website, such as the underlying web framework that is used, such as Apache Struts 2, Spring Framework, etc. And the last one is a list of, there's an enumeration of all the exposed get and post URLs. So these 3 form all attack surfaces of a given asset that are exposed to attackers. So Rich Security Solution, Ridgebot, uses the discovered attack surfaces as a foundation, as a context for the vulnerabilities that are scanned on the asset. This basically helps with putting the focus on the exposures that are discoverable, not just the ones that are exploitable, but exploitable as well as discoverable.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Home, for that detailed explanation. But after that explanation, I think it's time to turn it back to the audience again with another question. What do you think? So I'm gonna go back to question to another question and ask the audience this time, what type of technologies are you using for threat and vulnerability management? And I'm going to ask for your answers one more time. You know the rules, 45 seconds to answer. So I hope you're still with us. There's at least someone following us.
And you can select multiple choices here too.
Yes. So we're asking the audience, what type of technologies are you using for threat and vulnerability management? It's a multiple choice selection. I'm going to give it a few more seconds this time because it's a longer question. So you have penetration testing tools, vulnerability scanners, CMs, IDPs, web application security tools, endpoint security solutions, other, and none. People that are still responding. I'm going to give it a few more seconds so that we can have a comprehensive response. So I'm going to close it in 15 more seconds to get responses. And we're closing in 5, 4, 3, 2. Alrighty. So sharing the results so that we can have our experts commenting on the results and weighing in their experience.
I would say my only comment is a lot of different tools, right? A lot of different inputs. People are using a variety of different platforms to try to get some visibility into TVM.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also delighted to see that there are some folks who are actively using pen testing tools. And, as expected, there are more folks using vulnerability scanners than pen testing. But it's always good to see, pen testing tools, especially automated ones, getting utilized by our customers.
And at least no one said none, which is fantastic. So, Brian, based on your experience, what could you say that are the customers' most frequent pain points?
Yeah, so there's a couple of them that come to mind. We've talked a lot about automation and the continuous nature of CTEM. It's right there in the acronym. I think about using automation to augment and not necessarily replace staff. It's a way to get things done faster, to let my security operations team focus on really digging deep into incidents and issues. The other problem I see is people getting lost in just the vast amount of information. The previous poll question backs us up. You're using a lot of different inputs and tools. So you need to be able to do that prioritization and validation very well together. But the problem is using all those multiple tools, you're not really getting actionable results. What happens is security people end up suffering from what's called diagnostic fatigue. You're constantly looking at all these different tools and getting a second, third, fourth opinion, and you're not getting anything done. You fall into this analysis paralysis. The other thing is compliance has come up a few times here. Compliance takes a lot of effort, but a lot of times compliance does not equal security. We really need to evolve from a sort of pen test compliance to that state of security validation. What that means is things like measurable improvements, that continuous mindset, using realistic attack scenarios, ones that can ideally enhance your incident response runbooks and playbooks, and using smart automation that has a very high degree of repeatability.
Fantastic. Let's hope we can sort those pain points. At home, can you provide some examples on how Rich Security has already helped customers with their CTEM journey and how their pain points were resolved already?
Sure. There are a number of pain points that I would like to share based on what we've heard from our customers. One key pain point that is seen by our customers is the large amount of exposure information that they need to digest. Like one typical example is the huge list of potential vulnerabilities. So automated solutions that also utilize AI they can make a big difference because they are armed with a knowledge base that gets updated on a frequent basis. It can basically, being a piece of software, it can work tirelessly around the clock. Also being AI powered, they can, as I mentioned earlier, they can mimic an attacker in a reasonably good way, reasonably accurate way. We have a number of financial organizations, financial institutions that utilize Rich Security's automated pen testing platform, RichBot, to prioritize their exposures. They like the fact that RichBot helps them identify the exposures and focus on the exposures that are most likely to be exploited by the attackers. And also they like the fact that it provides detailed kill chain analysis of such exposures for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. If they're not able to treat that exposure right, by remediating it right then and there, then they can use the kill chain information to put a stopgap solution in place to prevent the attackers from exploiting that exposure. The other common pain point that our customers report to us, or during the sales cycle, they would bring up with us, is the shortage of security staff. That's the most common story that we hear from our customer, most common pain point. So we are able to, by having an automated pen testing solution, we are able to empower our customers to delegate some tedious work, such as pen testing and red teaming tasks, to RichBot. As Brian said, the intent is not to replace human testers, is just to give them more free cycles so that they can focus on more important things, such as remediation, planning remediation, etc. So, so the customers like the fact that the solution is AI powered because it uses AI to think like a hacker, and this basically helps our customers increase their confidence to delegate various security validation tasks to RichBot. So to recap this particular pain point, our customer security staff shortage is addressed by the fact that RichBot is both automated and AI powered. And there is one other pain point that I want to share. This is something that we've noticed with our more mature customers. So basically, they're looking for an affordable way to perform continuous security validation. For example, they want to do continuous pen testing as opposed to pen testing only once or twice a year or every quarter, which is typically driven by compliance requirements. So these customers realize that their environments, regardless of whether they are on-prem or cloud-based, they are very dynamic and they continue to evolve. And having a once a year or once a quarter security validation is just not going to cut it. So they feel the need to perform a more frequent pen testing, for example. But this at the same time has to be affordable. Of course, they can use manual pen testers to perform pen testing, once a month, and also on an ad hoc basis whenever they add a new, for example, they launch a new app or, new assets come into their organization, but that won't be affordable. So the combination of the solution supporting continuous as well as being affordable, both of these adjectives have to be there. It addresses the pain point of our more mature customers. I also want to make one point. As you've heard many times by Brian and me, CTEM is a cycle. It's a cyclic process. So continuous security validation is precisely what CTEM recommends. And that's something that RichBot is geared to do.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tom. Now, while I'm sharing the resources that we have to give to our attendees, I have reached to the end of the questions that I have for you, but I have received several questions from the audience. And since we still have some minutes, I wanted to take the opportunity to go through those questions. Out of the 3 steps of CTEM where rich security offers a solution, which one is the most critical? Which one to initial focus on? So Home, probably you can jump on this question.
Sure. You heard us earlier comment on the importance of the prioritization phase. So I would just, if I'm forced to pick one, I would say prioritization is the most important one. I mean, by no means am I saying that the other steps are not important, but it's in this particular step of CTEM where a lot of noise gets filtered out. And Rich Security Solution does a very good job of helping you to filter out a lot of noise. And for example, out of thousands of vulnerability, you just want to focus on the tens of vulnerabilities that are exploitable right now, and are actionable. So I would say I would pick prioritization as the one. Brian, anything you want to add to that?
No, I would agree with you. I think that really, I think about, like I said, that bottom layer, the steps 2, 3, and 4 of CTEM, and prioritization is really what helps you set the stage for what needs to move on to validation. So, yeah, I would agree with your point. Technically they're all equal weight, they're all important, like you said, but if you had to pick one, prioritization is really where things start happening and decisions start happening ultimately.
Excellent. I have another question, and I invite everybody to continue submitting your questions. We still have some time. Does CTEM recommend only external pen testing, or is internal pen testing of no value according to CTEM? Whoa.
Yeah, I'll take this one, and Home can jump in here too. When I walk through the 5 steps of CTEM and you look at discovery, like I said, it goes beyond traditional asset management. Certainly external vuln data is important, but internal vuln data helps give you insight. More information is always a good thing. So it's not, it's not devalued because it's just, here, I ran an internal pen test, it's a snapshot in time. There's still value to be had there. But it's a single input into a lot of other inputs that you're using to build that threat exposure management picture and that mindset.
Yeah, I fully agree with your answer, Brian. At any given point in time, of course, CTEM says you should focus on what's the exposures that are reachable by attackers right now and take an action there. Do a treatment of the exposures. But like you said, having that internal pen testing information helps with future cycles of CTEM when you go through the same process over and over again. Incidentally, Rich Security often recommends to our customers, if they're able to do so, they should perform both external pen testing and internal pen testing. You get a lot more information and more data points that way for decision making.
Next question. What's CTEM position on automated remediation of exposures?
Yeah, I'll start and take this one too, and let Ham fill this in. But just like I mentioned in the mobilization section, when we talk about that 5th part of CTEM, when you're actually putting it all together, the idea here is that you're not going to automate everything. You're going to automate the things that you have a high degree of confidence and repeatability around. So it's not like you're not waving a magic wand and sprinkling automation or AI on everything. You're automating the things that have a high degree of confidence and repeatability, things that you've already done the hard work that Home and I just talked about under prioritization, and you've done that prioritization, you've successfully validated and understood. That's when those things, when I was saying earlier, you can get really good with operationalizing this and moving very quickly through the phases. You absolutely can on those things that are highly repeatable. And I'm sure Home wants to talk about RidgeBot.
Not quite, actually. I just want to underline, underscore what CTEM says about the organizational acceptance. That buy-in from all stakeholders. So if all stakeholders agree, Brian, as you said, that there are certain repeatable exposures that can be remediated automatically, by all means, let's do that. But it has to be something that all stakeholders buy into.
Right.
I have 2 more questions for now, unless anybody drops another one. What does CTEM recommend about threat exposures that are caused by a vulnerability that we cannot patch right away because of operational viability issues?
Okay, I will get the ball rolling with that, Brian, and feel free to jump in any
Go
time.
for it.
So, yeah, we kind of touched upon this earlier. It's the treatment of the exposure that's of importance. You don't necessarily have to be patching a vulnerability. Of course, that's the ultimate fix. You go to the root cause and, for example, upgrade your Windows OS to such and such version, or install a particular patch level on your Linux server, etc. But if you're not in a position to do that, by all means, use whatever data points, the tools that you, security validation tools that you use provide to you in order to prevent the attackers from reaching that exposure.
Yeah, I would say a couple of examples of those kinds of tools. You might have something where you can't patch, let's say, an on-premises server, but you can put in an intrusion detection or prevention rule into blocking mode. This is the classic 2-decade plus now use of IPS, network IPS. So that's a great example. Another one is, let's say you've got some sort of endpoint-based vulnerability, either on Windows, Mac, or on a browser of some sort. You could redirect somebody to an isolated session, or you could use something like a Cloud Web Gateway or a CASB to mitigate that control. Let's say you've got something around, let's say, Windows Office vulnerability that you can't patch around, Microsoft Office or something. You could say, hey, look, for the meantime, I want anybody who interacts with SharePoint Online and OneDrive to run in an isolated fashion. And we might do that until we're sure that we can remediate. So there's a lot of different mitigations and there's different treatments that we can take without needing to fully patch. So it's not just we've got a vulnerability and we've got to patch this. This is where CTEM is different. We're getting exposure to the actual threats, the actual situation on the ground, and we're acting accordingly.
Excellent, thank you. And Home, I have one question that's designed for you. It was targeted for you. Does Bridge Security offer any special license that can support the CTEM scope? The CTEM.
That's an interesting question. We don't have any special licenses for CTEM per se. We do have one license, we call it the end user license, which is based on an annual subscription, and it allows unlimited security testing of a given asset, with an asset being either an IP host or a website. So given that CTEM is a cyclical process, it's a cycle that keeps repeating. So you definitely want to have this kind of a license that allows you to perform, for example, automated pen testing, let's say on a monthly basis, and then on an ad hoc basis as the need arises, without worrying about consuming more licenses.
Fantastic. I do not have any further questions. Calling for all participants to raise any questions if you have any at this moment. There are no further questions at this point. So with that, thank you very much to everybody for joining us, for your time. Thank you, Home. Thank you, Brian, for your expertise on the matter, and looking forward to seeing you in any other instance.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.